All right, we're going to have our quiz at the beginning of class on Tuesday. It'll be in this classroom, so you can expect that there's a good chance that the quiz is going to have to do with something on the computer. And today we're going to continue talking about internal rates of return and introduce the idea of incremental analysis, and I'm hoping that we'll also have a little bit of extra time at the end of class to start talking about the project some more. So are there any questions about the announcements? All right, everybody has a copy of the homework. Let me now also hand out today's in-class exercise. What we're going to do today is look at a proof. Unless I'm interrupting, I'll continue. We're going to look at a proof today that you shouldn't compare internal rates of return, that you have to be very careful about doing that. In the homework that you just submitted, the problem that had to do with the lottery, it's a very narrow set of situations where it's okay to compare internal rates of return. And on that lottery problem, the reason why it would be okay to compare internal rates of return is because the investment amounts were the same. That, you won the lottery and you're trying to figure out if you're going to take the payout over time or the payout now. But in most cases, actually, you shouldn't do a comparison of internal rates of return, and this in-class exercise is going to show that. Let me bring it up on screen here. All right. So what we have is a problem where there's two projects, Project A and Project B, and we're going to compare the internal rates of return. And then we're also going to calculate the present worth of both alternatives. So remember, there's a lot of different ways to calculate the IRR. You could either do it manually with goal-seek, or you can just use the IRR function. Either one is fine for this one. You've got the initial investment for Project A is $50,000. The initial investment for Project B is $85,000. And then you can see that there's an annual income for both of those projects. But calculate the IRR for both, and then calculate the present worth for each of them, and then answer these questions. Which one looks best? According to the IRR method, and that'll give you a false view of which one looks best, but then the correct view of which one looks best will be given to you when you do the present worth analysis. All right, so let me pause the recording. You can get started on this one. And we'll try and see why you should never compare the IRR of different projects. Okay, let's talk about these numbers, because it's one thing to do the calculations, but sometimes it's a completely different thing to actually understand and be able to replicate this analysis on your own. All right, so we begin with two different cash flow diagrams to consider. We can either go for option A or option B. And we're borrowing the money from the bank for either of these projects. Here, where it's saying that the MAR is 4%, what you need to think is that this original investment of $50,000, you don't have that money. And so you're going to take a loan for $50,000 or take a loan of $85,000. And what you hope is you hope that the project gives you more back than how much you're paying to the bank. Because if the project gives you less than you're paying to the bank, then you're losing money and you're having to do all the work of the project. So that's terrible. So the question is, can you beat the amount you have to pay the bank? And so the first thing that we do here, you'll notice the IRR analysis. And so you can do the IRR function directly on the amounts. You don't have to worry about changing the sign. You don't have to worry about excluding the first value. It's just you take the entire cash flow range, apply the IRR function, and it will tell you what is the internal rate of return. So at first glance, maybe you're tempted to think that project A is better, just because the percentage rate is higher. But remember where you got the original investment amount. You borrowed it from the bank. And so the question is, if you're borrowing the money from the bank at 4%, would you rather have the difference between the two is essentially what you get to keep? Would you rather have 12.4% minus the 4% you're giving to the bank on a loan amount of $50,000, or would you rather have 10.3% minus the 4% you're giving to the bank on a loan of $85,000? That's the real question. The real question is, how much profit can you have for either project? Because the purpose of companies is to maximize their profits. It's not to maximize the internal rate of return. You know, it's nice to have a high percentage, but really what you want is you get to keep one of two amounts. When you do the sum of the present worths, what you're doing is find the present value at the MAR. And what these amounts are going to represent, this sum of the present worth amount, this represents how much is left over after you pay back the bank. So these quantities I've just put in bold here, after you pay back the bank, you can choose. Do you want to keep $28,500 or do you want to keep $22,998? Well, obviously you want to keep the amount that's the greatest. And so what this illustration shows you is that it's not always the project with the highest IRR that gives you the most profits. If the amounts were the same, then you can choose the project with the highest IRR. But here the amounts were different. And so a smaller return on a greater quantity of money will yield you the biggest sum of the present values. Now this net present value method, here I just did the function of calculating the NPV directly instead of having this other column of the present worth of the amounts. All right, so remember on quizzes, sometimes it's problem solving and sometimes it's concept questions or short answer. So would you be able to explain why you shouldn't choose the project with the highest IRR? It depends on the amount that was invested, right? And the question is, are these projects mutually exclusive? Do you remember what that phrase mutually exclusive means? Anyone? Yeah? That's right. It means you can only pick one of the options. And so if you are buying a delivery truck and you only need one truck, you can either choose the Toyota truck or the Mitsubishi truck. But in choosing one, you exclude the other option. So here, this was assuming that the alternatives are mutually exclusive, that you can just pick one of each, and so it's better to go for project B. And this is a proof of the idea that you should not go as simple as calculating the internal rates of return. Now what about the external rate of return? That's what we were doing with Excel last time in class. How does external rate of return avoid that problem? Do you remember what the assumption is between, I talked about these hidden landmines for IRR. One of the landmines with IRR is the idea that you can't compare the internal rates of return, and that we just proved why with this example. But do you remember what the other landmine has to do with what IRR assumes? Right, yeah. So IRR assumes that the money you get from the project you can reinvest back into the project, and it's going to receive the same rate of return. And so can you give me an example of when that is valid? Like what sorts of investments or projects is it okay to say, yes, it's likely you can reinvest in the same thing? Like a savings account, exactly, because the bank will allow you to keep your money in the bank and they'll pay more interest on the interest that they gave you originally. And then what's an example of a type of a project where probably you can't reinvest your earnings into the same project? What's that? Like a painting, yeah. Actually, most projects can't reinvest in exactly the same thing over again, because whether it's a painting or a computer system, once you've made an investment, you can't have that exact same investment unless you're a company, let's say for instance, with lots of different regional offices. And so if you upgraded the computers in one office and you saw their productivity boosted, then maybe you can make that same upgrade in other locations and have the same return. So that would be an example where maybe you could make a reinvest the benefits from one office into making the same upgrade in another one. But that's the other caution. If you just remember in review why we need to be careful with the IRR is because the reinvestment assumption and then the idea that you can't compare IRR. Now last time in class we were talking about external rates of return, and we had epsilon, and then we were using I. And so there were two different interest rates. Do you remember what the name for epsilon was? External reinvestment rate. Okay, and then the I that we were solving for was the external rate of return. Now, what makes it a little bit confusing is they both have the word external in them, right? But let's just clarify. External reinvestment rate is the secondary rate that you can put all of the earnings into. And so if you were an art dealer and you sold a painting, you would take your profits and maybe then you'd put those profits into a bank account until the next time you're ready to buy another painting. And so that would be the external account. Whatever interest rate you can earn on the external account is the epsilon in that problem-solving process. But then the external rate of return that we solved, that's an average. It averages not only the rate at which cash is generated, and you see that in the cash flow diagram. The cash flow diagram is telling you, you make a certain investment and then you're getting the returns over time. So this drawing represents some sort of a return system, but then there's also the returns of the money, putting it into the bank, and it's compounding due to the external reinvestment rate. So the external rate of return is an average that takes into account the quantities and the frequency of returns, and then also where you're putting the returns over time. So I'd encourage you to think through, and you spend a lot of money on the textbook, so it would be, you'd be getting your money's worth if you read through the textbook's way of explaining external reinvestment rate, external rate of return, and so on, in preparation for our quiz on Tuesday. All right. So, as a reminder, we don't want to compare alternatives and choose the one with the highest IRR. We want to choose the project with the most profit. All right. So where we're headed from here is something called incremental analysis. And in incremental analysis, what we're going to do is we're going to look at two projects and ask ourselves the question, for the project that's more expensive, is the additional amount we have to pay worthwhile? So let's say, for instance, that you have the choice between two cars. You're thinking, should you either buy the Hyundai or the Honda car? And one of them is more expensive. Let's just say in this example, the Honda is more expensive. So what you're going to do is you're going to analyze the difference between the two cars. You're going to analyze the difference in cost, and then also, presumably, if the Honda is more expensive, maybe the reason they're charging more is because you'll spend less on maintenance over time. And so you're going to ask, is the initial upfront expense worth the returns that you get over time? You know, the savings and expenses are considered returns to you. So here on the screen, what this is illustrating is if we were comparing option A and B, then both of these are what's called cost alternatives. Cost alternatives are the options that don't have a revenue that's being generated, but they only have expenses over time. And the reason why we do projects like this is to enable other parts of the company to generate profit. So comparing vehicles, they just have expenses, but without the vehicle, you couldn't do the delivery and get the revenues from that. So here we've got two options. Option B, you can see when we do B minus A, option B is $20,000 more expensive, but then the annual costs are less per year. We have a savings of $6,000 per year if we do option B. And then we would find an incremental salvage value as well. And so the way that problems like this normally work is that we'd know a certain MAR, our minimum acceptable rate of return, and we'd know how long the project lasts. And the analysis you do, the criteria is this $20,000 that you have to spend. Is it justifiable? Should you spend the extra amount in order to get these savings for a certain number of years? And the part that we're going to do on the in-class exercise today is very simple. If you flip over the paper, you'll see where it says increments. And what we're going to do on the increments is just calculate the increments, the increment amounts. Oops, I don't want to show you the solution yet. It's easy enough not to show you the solution already. So calculate the incremental amount. Okay, so the incremental amounts are just based on the cash flow amounts. It's not based on the present worth, anything like that. So when we get together on our next class period, we're going to start getting into more depth about the incremental analysis. So I want to pause on the incremental analysis and shift our focus on another direction, unless there's any questions about this. This is pretty straightforward. But the reason why we took a first look at this is that when you have multiple alternatives, like when you're comparing 4 different things, what you need to do is always start with the cheapest one as the baseline comparison. And then we're gradually going to compare them in order of least expensive to most expensive. That's what we're going to see as our sort of approach next time. Now, here is a graphical way of showing what we were looking at earlier in this in-class exercise. Let's say, for instance, you have 2 alternatives, and one of them gives you a higher internal rate of return than the other. This is a graphical illustration that if you discount the amounts that, in our example, we saw that one of the amounts had a higher present worth, but it had a lower internal rate of return. There's a crossover point at which the 2 alternatives have the same value. And this is also something that we'll come back to in the future and look at what we call like the break-even internal rate of return, at which both projects have the same present worth when we discount them based on the cash flow diagrams that we're given. So we don't necessarily want the highest IRR, we want the amount that gives us the highest present worth, and when it's an incremental analysis, the question is the additional investment worth more than the MAR? And so here is the additional investment for both of the alternatives, and the MAR is 4% is how much we have to pay to the bank. So if you're paying the bank 4%, what we want to find out when we do incremental analysis is the $35,000 extra that you have to spend, is that more, or is the future revenues discounted to the present worth more? So that's incremental analysis. That's where we're headed. Now, let's talk about the project. That's coming up in the announcement slide. I think I reminded you that the project is due Sunday, April 17th. So we've got less than a month now. Today is March 20th, and the project's due on Sunday, April 17th. How many people have done something? It doesn't matter how much, but how many people have done at least one thing for the project? Oof, pretty grim. Pretty grim. All right. Well, if you've thought about the project, that's something. So who's done something for the project? Who's at least thought about the project? All right? Yeah, all right. Not as many as I would have hoped, but some. So occasionally we're going to have some extra time to discuss questions that come up as you're working on the project. Maybe today and 2 or 3 other times before it's due. Let me give you some pointers. When you are working on the income, you're, I think, probably going to be surprised at how low the starting salaries are once you graduate. But what you'll find when you talk to people who've graduated in the past is that the salaries go up a lot in the first couple of years following graduation. But for the expenses, last semester, as a warning, there were some students who found like these averages online. Like it says the average cost of living in Dubai is a certain amount per month. But the problem with averages like that is that some people live in Dubai and really expensive housing, maybe at the Jumeirah Beach or at the marina. And some people in Dubai live in much more economical housing. And so the project is really supposed to be based on your own anticipated expenses and lifestyle. And the same thing is true for investment. Like you can't just assume a certain percentage without doing some research in advance on what sorts of investments you plan to put your savings, your extra savings into. And so, if it's a savings account, you need to find an actual bank interest rate that you say you're going to do the investments at. If it's stocks, let me show you a way that you can find out how much stocks may be able to yield you. There's a website operated by Google. It's their finance website. And if you just go to finance.google.com, you can type in this ticker for different stocks. For example, Microsoft, MSFT is the ticker for Microsoft. And here, what it shows you in this field is the dividend and the yield. And so right now, if you wanted to buy a share of Microsoft, you'd have to pay $53.49. That's the current price for Microsoft. But if you bought that, the way that you make money is twofold. Number one, that price can go up over time, and so then you could sell it, and you get to keep the difference between what you paid originally and the sales price at the end. Now, you don't know what the sales price in the future might be. It could go up or it could go down. In the case of Microsoft, if we wanted to look at over time, If you bought Microsoft back in 1987, for example, you notice here where it's saying the price back in 1987 was like 50 cents per share. And now it's $50. And so in that time period, the price has grown by 100 times. So that would have been a really great investment. Now, it's probably not going to go up by 100 times in the future. Like, it's gone through its growth spurt. But the other way that it makes money is by dividends. So here it's showing you the dividend yield. And the way it works is that this dividend amount of 36 cents, if you compare the dividend amount and the frequency of the dividend to the stock price, Microsoft is paying a return of 2.69%. And so that is the yield. Like every 3 months they will give 36 cents to their shareholders, and as a percentage of the initial purchase price, that works out to 2.69%. And so you can look at Apple, for example. Apple, oops. They have a dividend yield of 1.96%. So they pay a lower dividend, but some people say that Apple is more likely to grow over time. And if we zoom out on the price data in the past, you could have bought their stock for 29 cents back in the 80s, and now it's worth 105. So that's another company that's grown just like really, really done well over time. Some stocks pay more than others, and some stocks actually don't pay any dividend at all. Here's General Electric, 3% is how much they're paying. But if we look at Google, Alphabet is the new holding company for Google. If you look at Google, they don't pay a dividend. So the only way that you can make money by buying shares of Google is by you buy it at a low price and you hope that it increases over time. So when you do your report for the project, you're going to need to include some text that supports the assumptions you make. And so you say, I'm interested in investing my savings in stocks for a certain period of the time, and you pick a few stocks and you say what the dividend yield is, and you could maybe make some modest assumption on how the amounts are going to grow over time. So in the end, remember, it's supposed to be a table. And I think I have the summary table format earlier on here. I'm not sure which lecture I first showed you the, oh yeah, it's here. Right. So you're going to have this table in your report, but it also needs to be written text where you're explaining the research you did and also justifying and explaining the assumptions you make. So you won't be able to do this project at the last minute. You should just schedule an hour here, an hour there to do a little bit of research, to set up the spreadsheet. I mean, that would be something you could do very easily, setting up the spreadsheet and starting to play around with the numbers, just so that you feel like you're not putting it off to the last minute. All right, so that's all I have for you today. Remember that when we get together in class on Tuesday, we have a quiz, so I will see you then. Have a good day.